today I want to talk specifically about work factors, all the factors that directly relate to your job and that influence your job satisfaction. There are 6 things in total, and while I go through this list, please do let me know in the comments which one of these you think specifically applies to you. And the goal is that after going through this list, you can have a better understanding of what it is exactly that bothers you about your job. So instead of just saying that you're so stressed about it, that you're so tired all the time, you can pinpoint exactly what the problem is. And from there, you can either try and change something about the situation in your job, or change your perception about your job, or you might even decide to leave your job and look out for another job at which you might be happier. Number 1 is task variety, and this basically means how varied the activities and the tasks are that you do in your job on a daily basis. And on average, jobs with a high task variety will lead to happier employees, and this is easy to understand. Imagine that on a daily basis, you work in a job where you do the same things over and over again, as though you work at an assembly line and repeat the same things over and over again, and after a while that can really make you bored. So ask yourself, is the reason that you're unhappy in your current job perhaps because there is no variety, because you're doing the same things over and over again and don't find it challenging? But on the other hand, there can also be jobs that have too big of a task variety for some people. Perhaps you are unhappy in your job because you find that you have to do too many different things, that you have to multitask too much, that you are dealing with too many different projects, that it really takes a toll on you, it stresses you out, and thus makes you unhappy. Number 2 is colleagues. Based on research, and this is common sense of course, that if people have good colleagues at work, they are likely to have higher job satisfaction. But the interesting thing is that based on research, having good colleagues is even more important than the relationship with your supervisor. The reason for this might be because most people will have more and more intense interactions with their colleagues compared to with their supervisor. But of course, on a case-by-case basis, this might be different. Perhaps on a daily basis, you spend much more time with your supervisor and don't have any colleagues. And that might also be a reason why you're unhappy in your job. Perhaps the reason is because your colleagues aren't as great, or you don't have as many colleagues. It's important to figure out for yourself what is important to you in terms of having colleagues. There are certain people who are perhaps really introverted, who do not need to have a lot of colleagues. And in fact, they prefer to work on their own. Perhaps they like collaboration, but they do not necessarily have to have colleagues around them to chat with them, discuss with them. And that is why some people are better suited to working alone, or working remote, or working freelance, because they do not have that big of a need for interaction with other people. So ask yourself, could the reason why you're unhappy in your current job is because you are either lacking colleagues, or you have colleagues but they're not really great, or perhaps they even annoy you? And also ask yourself, how important is this to you? I know people who are not that fond of their job, but they stick to their job. They work in the same job for around 20 years because they love their colleagues so much. It's really different from person to person. It's just important to identify how important it is to you to have good colleagues around you during work. Of course, what makes a good colleague is different from person to person. For some people, a colleague who talks a lot and makes a lot of jokes is a great colleague, but for other people, they prefer to have a more quiet space. So what matters to them is have colleagues who respect their space, don't interrupt their work, and are more calm in general. And according to research, it's not only important to have good colleagues, but it's also important to many people to feel like they're part of a team that shares the same goals and the same values. Number 3 is working conditions, and this includes things like the working environment, the facilities in the office, also the company culture. And these are all things that in general it's difficult to do something about. Usually these things are a given and you can't do that much about it. That is why it's even more important to identify if this is something, for example, the organizational culture in the company you work at, is something that really bothers you, because if it's something that bothers you and you can't change it, then you might have to consider leaving the company for another company where the culture is more of a match with you. There are, for example, companies who overemphasize meeting goals and they don't care about the process and there is no alignment. All that the company, the bosses, the supervisors want to know is whether the goal is met or not, and apart from that, they don't care a lot about their employees. There are company cultures that are very open, where, for example, two-way feedback is encouraged. But then there are other companies at which hierarchy is more important and where all the decision making is more top-down. So think about whether that is something that's important to you, if it's something that bothers you, and if it is, then it's time to go ahead and look out for another job at another company. Number 4 is workload, and this has to do with the time pressure at work and whether you're often asked to stay overtime to complete more work, as well as the work volume. So ask yourself if perhaps the problem all this while is simply because the workload is too big. And specifically in this case, there might be something that you could do. For example, you could talk to your boss, but of course you have to be careful, sensitive, and a bit diplomatic about how you go about it. It will depend largely on how long you've been at the company, how your performance has been, can largely affect how successful you will be at talking to your boss about the problem of your workload. When it comes to workload, an important thing to think about is also whether the workload is something that is actually expected of you, or is it something that you think that the company expects? Because there are certain people who are so hardworking, so conscientious, that they do more than what is actually expected from them. So ask yourself whether the pressure relating to workload really comes from the company, from the job to you, or is it something that you create? In general, a workload that is too high leads to less job satisfaction, of course, but there is also such a thing as too low of a workload, and this is of course relative. It's different from person to person. Every person experiences a workload differently. I've worked at one of these jobs once where the workload was too low, meaning that there was nothing going on in the store, there was not much to do, and I had to come up with more things to do in order to keep myself occupied. I think that for every person there is a kind of a sweet spot when it comes to workload. You have to know yourself very well. What is the ideal workload at which you think that you perform optimally? And this is not only relevant for people who are employees, but also for people who are self-employed or are entrepreneurs. If you work on your own, then it is really easy to keep on working and not set any limit on your work or your workload. So after a while, if you feel very stressed, burnt out, or unhappy, then perhaps it's time to ask yourself, am I at a sweet spot when it comes to my workload, or is the workload currently too much? Because more is not always better. There was a study that says that most people only work productively for 3 hours or perhaps up to 5 hours. If you work 8 hours, 10 hours non-stop without any break, then you might come to a breaking point, a point at which you're not performing optimally anymore. Number 5 is autonomy, and there are two things related to this. The first one is whether or not your work and the results of it are clearly linked to you or not, meaning that if something goes well in your job, you get the credit. Your supervisor actually acknowledge that it was due to your hard work. And on the other hand, if something goes wrong, if goals are not met, then you are also the one to accept the blame. So research says that people experience a higher level of job satisfaction if they work in a job where this link is clear. The other thing related to autonomy is how much control you have over your work or working day, meaning can you decide what you want to work on, when you want to work on it, how you want to work on it? Do you have the freedom to create solutions, to figure out a problem on your own? Or do you always have to ask other people, someone else, for permission to do every single thing? And the level of autonomy that people need will be very different from person to person. There are, of course, people who prefer that someone tells them exactly what they need to do, so they don't need to schedule their day. They don't need to think about how they do it or figure out creative solution. They just accept the orders and the steps that are given to them, and they just carry them out. But I do think that the majority of people would want to have autonomy in their work, and some people need much more autonomy. I think that I am one of those people. And on the extreme end, people who require an extremely high level of autonomy to perform at their best are perhaps more suited to be self-employed, work as entrepreneur, compared to being an employee working for someone else, following someone else's rules. So important here is to ask yourself, how much autonomy do you need in your work? What is the ideal amount of autonomy? And there's actually something that you can do about it. If in your current job you feel like you don't have enough autonomy, you can talk to your supervisor. You can do something about it. Of course, you have to think carefully how to go about it, but one way to do that would, for example, be propose solutions or ask whether there are certain things that you could go ahead and decide on your own. But of course, there will be cases where the level of autonomy is a given. Perhaps your company or your boss is inflexible about it, and then you have to ask yourself, how important is autonomy for you? For some people, it won't matter too much. Like I said before, for some people, most important is whether they have good colleagues or not. But for other people, autonomy is really important, and it can be a deal breaker. Number 6 is educational opportunities. In general, people will be happier in their jobs if they feel that they have the chance to grow and develop and learn new things. No one wants to be stagnant. People have a tendency towards self-actualization, which means that they want to continuously grow and develop. And educational opportunities does not only refer to formal opportunities such as taking part in seminars or trainings or classes, but it can also be informal. Are you working in a company, in a job in which you feel that you can learn something new, if not every day, at least every month, or do you feel that it's stagnant, that you're not learning anything new? So you might love your job a lot, you might enjoy it, you have the autonomy, you have the great colleagues, you have task variety, but you feel the need to grow and progress in your career, but you feel that in that job you can't. You are stuck in a way. It's like a dead end, and that is a reason for many people to change jobs, because they feel that they can no longer grow in their current job. So let me know in the comments below which one of these factors play a big role in your personal job satisfaction. Are you now able to pinpoint exactly what it is about your job that makes you so happy or perhaps so unhappy? And as a consequence of that, what are you going to do about it now? Are you going to try and figure out a way that you can change something about your job? Or are you going to change yourself or your perception about the job? Or are you going to make the ultimate decision and perhaps decide to leave your job, go out there and look for another job in which you might be happier? But let me tell you that that is not all that there is to it. If you really want to find out why you are unhappy in your job at work, then you might want to check out my other video, which I link up here, in which I give a complete overview of all the factors that influence job satisfaction or happiness at work. By the way, in case you're new to this channel, I make videos on career change and multiple careers, and one of my goals is that I want to help people like you to have the courage to go after the kind of career that is best for them and that they really want. As always, I thank you so much for watching, especially to those of you who stuck with me to the very end. I wish you an awesome day, all the best with your career, and I hope to catch you again soon.